This video has been made with the purpose of education and awareness of real crimes, and there is no disrespect intended to anyone. This is to help promote truth and justice for anyone who has been a victim of crime. What I'm about to report is what I have researched online, and I will welcome any corrections should they be required. Hello Berry True Crime fans, Ely Berry here with the first heist on this channel. Wanted to do this one for a long time, took a hell of a lot of research. So much material out there. You have to keep cross-referencing things, making sure that they're correct or, from authentic sources. It's also confusing about the people involved as well and exactly what their roles were in this heist. But this has been named Britain's biggest heist. It was also very, very famous for both its sheer audacity, the ingenuity required to do this of these career criminals dubbed the Grandpa Gang or Bad Grandpas or the Pensioner Gang or whatever you want to call them. A lot has been made about the fact that these men were much, much older than people who generally carried out this kind of crime. These were men who were experienced career criminals, and researching their story has been quite interesting to say the least. In the middle of the Holborn area of the London Camden Borough is a place called Hatton Garden, which is sometimes called the jewellery quarter of the UK. The street comes from Elizabethan judge Christopher Hatton, who apparently was Queen Elizabeth I's favourite judge. And he purchased a massive place near Hatton Garden. He had a mansion there, and there is a cathedral or a church that still stands there today from Elizabethan times. Actually predates Elizabethan times, actually. And it's only one of two buildings that go back to that time in London. So it goes back a long way. If you walk down Hatton Garden Street, you will be amazed at the amount of bling there is in these shop windows. It's just chocker with traders of jewels and diamonds and gold and watches. It's just wow. So it's like a hub for precious stones and precious metals and traders, those who really want to splash out the cash on getting themselves some really nice bling bling. There is one particular place that used to stand in Hatton Garden, and I say used to stand for a good reason, which will come apparent later, which was at number 88 to 90 Hatton Garden. And it was called the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Limited Company. This was a facility used by quite a lot of the traders in the area, as well as from near and afar, and private clients too, to store gold, jewellery, watches, cash, gems and stones, you name it, anything that was really worth a huge amount of money, and it was stored in this particular vault. The Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Facility had been erected in the 1940s. I watched a video about the measures that took place to try and keep everything as sealed and as secure as possible, and it did really seem impenetrable. The vaults were kept underground, so not accessible just by walking in the door. There were not only security guards and staff on site, but there were metal doors and shutters and even wooden doors as well. I mean, wood's easy to break through, but it was reinforced by lots of different networks of doors that had to have like several people operate them to open them, and including the vault steel door, which was reinforced very, very thick. And behind that were ceiling to floor cabinets that were bolted top and bottom. They were basic. If you go to like a swimming baths or something and you see the massive lockers that they have, a bit like that, but a lot more chic. They were the security boxes. They were also kept under lock and key, which you could only open if you had the combination or you broke them open. The wall between these cabinets and the outside was 1/2 meter thick, reinforced concrete. There were security cameras, which of course weren't there at the time in the 1940s, in the vault and outside of the vaults. The security company had a process by which that if there was anything suspicious, because there was an alarm there as well, which would alert the security company out of hours, they would let the police know and the police would therefore do their investigation. So this place really did seem impenetrable. But this gang of criminals we're going to talk about now did the impossible. And Hatton Garden, unfortunately, even though it was a place of extreme wealth and splendour, it's also a target for criminals and thieves. And this goes right back to the 1600s. But we're not going to focus on those just now. We're going to focus on what happened 7 years ago over the Easter weekend of 2015. I'm not quite sure how it works around the world, so I'm just going to say it from the British perspective, is that on Good Friday, the banks and all the financial businesses are usually closed, and they're usually closed as well on Easter Monday. So what happens is that on Thursday evening, when it's close of business as usual, business doesn't reopen again until the following Tuesday. This was no different for the Hatton Garden safe deposit facility. The traders in the area had quite a lot of their stock and their wealth and their security tied up physically in this safe deposit facility. And particularly over the Easter weekend, when quite a lot of those shops will either be open at limited hours or not open at all, they reinforced their wealth in this place and stocked up. Saturday and Sunday are not working days either. So over this particular Easter weekend of 2015, the Hatton Garden safe deposit facility was all but vacant. Not long after the close of business on the Thursday evening, the 2nd of April, the security guard on duty received a text message to say that the alarm at the vault had been triggered. He went along there, he didn't hear the alarm going off, but the alarm was such that even if it didn't actually go off like full blast, it would still send an alert to the security company, who would then alert the guard on duty that the alarm had somehow been triggered. It's not unusual for alarms to go off randomly or malfunction. And when the guard arrived, that's pretty much what he thought. He saw that there was nothing untoward around or outside of the facility, no sign of a break-in. The alarm wasn't sounding. But he did his due diligence and he informed the police as he normally would, and it would be down to the police to follow this up. However, the police didn't follow it up. There was a breakdown in communication, apparently, that meant it wasn't sent to the relevant people, therefore nothing was done. When Hatton Garden opened up for business again on the Tuesday, the 7th of April 2015, the staff on duty at the safe deposit facility received a shock. They walked in to chaos. Gates had been jemmied up, a wooden door had been smashed, the alarm had been disabled, wires had been cut, and the hard drives containing the CCTV footage of the vault itself had been removed. What really shocked people, though, was that the safe deposit facility had been breached, and it had been breached in a very, very strange and yet ingenious manner. When the police were informed about this break-in, the flying squad arrived. They went down into the vault and saw that there was concrete dust everywhere. There were bleach bottles, and the smell of bleach was intoxicating. There were 2 hydraulic rams, one of which had been broken, and a diamond drill. It was obvious by anyone looking at what they were looking at what the diamond drill had been used for. In the reinforced concrete wall were 3 overlapping circles that had been bored by this drill. And on the other side of the wall was the vault. It had been ransacked. The flying squad are a department of the Metropolitan Police who specialise in burglaries and robberies of this kind of nature. And they swooped down straight away and began their investigation. There were 999 safe deposit boxes in this vault. It was established that a very small amount had actually been broken open, 73. But still, it was estimated, and this amount of money that had been, or wealth that had been taken from this place varies from 10 million to 25 million pounds. Things that were stolen included cash, gold bars, watches, necklaces and rings, stones and metals. What the flying squad were able to easily establish that this was done by, it couldn't have been just one person. This had to have been executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. This was not on a whim. These were definitely people who were career criminals or professional criminals who had done this before, and they had thought of a lot. The bleach was to get rid of any DNA or fingerprints at the area. The first question was, how on earth did they get in? There was no sign of a forced break-in. I mean, of course, the gates had been jemmied, but the actual entrances to the facility itself hadn't actually been opened with force. The front door, as it goes straight onto the Hatton Garden street, and there was also the fire exit or the fire escape. There was CCTV footage around the perimeter of the safe deposit facility, and that was where the police first looked. At Thursday around 8 p.m, a white transit van drove past the facility and stopped. And out of that van came two men dressed in high-vis vests, or tabards, whichever you call them, and construction hats. They walked adjacent to the building, and they were followed by another man. This one was not actually wearing a high-vis vest, and it wasn't really clear if he actually had a hat on, because he was holding a big bag or a big sack over his left shoulder, which was next to the camera. And as he was walking towards the front door of the facility, he stopped and appeared to be fishing in his pocket for something. That is how the police believe the gang entered the vault. He somehow, it's still not been clear how, had a key made or had stolen the key and simply opened the door and got in. There was also another person who had got out of the van and walked across the road and didn't come away from wherever they were for quite some time. It was determined that this person was not actually going to be an active burglar, but was going to be the lookout. So 4 people they were pretty sure were involved. There was CCTV footage from inside the building as well that the burglars hadn't actually accounted for. They thought that only the vault was covered by cameras, but it was actually the fire escapes and the exits, and near where there was an elevator shaft too. What is thought is that the man carrying the bag opened the front door, made his way to the back of the building, let in his cohorts, and then they disabled the alarm, which had to be done in 1 minute by cutting the wires. But they didn't account for the fact that it already sent a text message to the security guard, and if the police had done their job, they would have thwarted this heist. But it was pure luck that that didn't happen. The CCTV footage of inside the facility itself was very grainy, not brilliant quality, but it did show the men in the high-vis suits and the one man in the boiler suit. There were actually 5 of them. Some of them were wearing dust masks as well as their hats, and cameras also because they angled downwards, and if you're wearing a hat, it's not really going to capture your full face. It may even capture just half your face. But here, it didn't really provide much help. But there was one thing that the police did notice about the man in the blue boiler suit. He had very distinctive red hair. At one point, he's seen walking towards a door and then turning away, and the hairline can be seen. From that image, the police were able to see that this was a wig. It had a very unusual shine and very, very sharp cut. This person had thought of even just not in disguising their face, using a wig to disguise themselves too. So there were 5 people that were seen entering this facility and 1 lookout, so 6 people in total. That doesn't mean though that there were not more involved. I mean, they could have accomplices and fences and, connections who know what's going on or help them out. But they were just focusing right now on these 6 individuals. Because the cameras inside the vaults had been disabled or, their hard drives had been stolen, the police really couldn't determine exactly what had happened there. They could only deduce from the remaining evidence that was there at the scene, and when they watched the cameras on the outside of the building the following day, they saw that these men left the facility on the Friday morning. But they didn't appear to be carrying bags or boxes or holdalls of loot. Yeah, the flying squad suspected that the gang had been thwarted somehow, or something hadn't quite gone according to plan. And they had, some point come back and try it again. And the continuous monitoring of this footage showed that their hunch was right. The gang made a return to the scene on the Saturday evening. The footage of the Saturday evening showed two men, one in high-vis, one in a black coat or overall, walking past the facility again. They then walked back. Then the police saw something that would give them the first and a major breakthrough in the case. The two men got into a white Mercedes that circled the block a few times, and its registration number was of course picked up on CCTV. The police had tried to trace the transit van before, and I haven't been able to get to the exact bottom of why they couldn't find the van or they couldn't trace it to an owner, but apparently it was owned by someone with a false, given a false name. That was a dead end. But this Mercedes was different. Now, even though it was a white Mercedes, it was very distinctive. This Mercedes had a black roof and black wheels. And because of the fact that it had been picked up on the camera's vehicle registration software, it was easy to trace. London is one of the most surveyed places in the world. I mean, if you had access to every single security camera, dash cam or footage, cameras on a bus, you can trace anyone's journey, be it on foot, on a bike, in a car, whichever, all the way through the city if you could. And this was no different to this particular vehicle. The vehicle was traced about 2 miles away. The owner of the vehicle was confirmed to be one Mr. John Kenny Collins. He was a 74-year-old career criminal. He was not unknown to the police. He'd spent many a time in prison for different robberies and heists, and Collins would become the gateway into the identity of the Hatton Garden burglars. Collins was identified within just a few days of the discovery of the heist, and an undercover police operation followed him, going to various different places and meeting up with many different people. It was thought and hoped that the criminals would get cocky, that they would start meeting up and talking about what happened, loose lips sink ships. What is the first rule of Fight Club? Seriously. But of course, even someone who has just pulled off this audacious and pretty amazing heist, not everyone they're going to meet with outside is going to be even remotely connected to this. They might even meet up with unwitting family members and friends or acquaintances. So every single person that John Kenny Collins met up with had to be investigated and eliminated, even if under the radar. But before all this really went down, the press got hold of the images of the men on CCTV. This was problematic because these images were published. Each man was given his own kind of moniker, like a nickname. There was the man with the red hair was called Mr. Ginger. The man who was seen walking away, which was later determined to be John Kenny Collins, he was called the Tall Man. The police were not happy about what the press had done because they had published the clothing and the hats and the equipment that the men had on that night. This could alert the burglars to get rid of that, so there wouldn't be that kind of evidence tying them to the crime. During the surveillance of Collins during his normal everyday life, within just about 2 or 3 weeks, he was seen meeting up with another man who was also in his 70s. Now, this isn't to be discriminatory, but if Collins, who was in his 70s, was part of this heist, it would make sense that his cohorts would be within a similar age group. The police looked into the man that Collins was meeting up with, and it turned out that this man was Brian Reeder. Like Collins, he was also in his 70s, and he too had been a career criminal. He had taken part in really high-profile heists and many other crimes, and at one point he was tried but found not guilty of the murder of a police officer. The flying squad was sure that Reeder must be involved in the heist. I mean, it can't be coincidence that these two men are meeting up in cafes after such a crime, and it's the kind of thing that Reeder, it's part of his MO. The case didn't just make headlines. The police made public appeals to anyone who knew how to operate a diamond drill. There was a segment on Loose Women, which is a UK daytime TV. It's a bit like the British version of The View. A lot of people laughed about it, but this was very serious. I mean, there were so many things that had been stolen And I'm going to get onto later why this really was not a victimless crime, contrary to what people thought it was. Going back to the CCTV footage, the gang was shown as leaving on the Sunday morning, and they did actually leave in the white transit van. But this time there were wheelie bins going out with them. So the police knew that this was the night when the burglary was successful. The flying squad also wondered if the reason why one of the hydraulic rams was broken was the reason why the first attempt had failed. Because what the gang had not known, or appeared not to know, is that the cabinet on the other side of the concrete wall that they drilled into, it wasn't freestanding, it wasn't something that you could just push over, and it wasn't just heavy. It was secured top and bottom. It would need a huge amount of pressure in order to push it over, and the hydraulic ram had broken. They had to get another one, a much stronger one, and there's very few places that you can actually get one like that. After reviewing Collins' phone records, the police found that he had actually made a phone call to a place called D&M Tools in Twickenham on the Saturday afternoon, just before the gang made their second attempt. So the next stage was to find any kind of camera footage for that particular area of London. And sure enough, Kenny Collins, his Mercedes pulls up outside. Out gets another mysterious man. Not Collins and not Reader. This man went into D&M Tools, and this is where, you know, when criminals make stupid mistakes. In order to buy this drill, he had to give his name and address and have his photograph taken. Photograph, I mean, you can display it wherever you want, but he gave his real name and his real address. His name was Daniel Jones. So they had Collins, Reader, and Jones. They had to find the other 3 people involved in this, at least the 3 that they knew of. Using legal permissions, the police managed to bug Collins and Jones' vehicles and record their conversations. It was hoped that they would mention other people's names or give more details as to what they did to pull off this heist, or if there was anyone else outside involved as well. A further meeting between Collins and Reader brought another name to light: Terry Perkins. So there was Collins, the lookout, there was Reader, there was Jones, and now there's Perkins. Perkins, much like the others, and Jones, all career criminals. So the lookout was definitely identified, and 3 of the 5 burglars were also identified. The press had nicknamed Collins the Tall Man, Reader as the Gent, Jones as Montana, and Perkins as the Old Man. But there were 2 others. There was Mr. Ginger, who had the very strange red wig, and there was also a man the press had dubbed Mr. Strong, or the Strong One, because he was seen holding and pulling the wheelie bin, probably which contained the diamond drill and equipment. During the police's undercover surveillance of these 4 men, a meeting took place between Collins, Perkins, and Reader at a pub called the Castle. The police actually managed to get a seat very, very close to them and have a camera trained right on them. They were literally just a meter away, but they couldn't get the audio. So this meeting relied on lip-reading experts to deduce exactly what was said. The problem was, though, only Perkins and Collins' faces could be shown, and Reader was actually facing away from the camera, so it couldn't really be determined exactly what he said. What the police actually found was that, which actually corroborated with the CCTV footage inside of the facility on the second night, was that unlike the first night, there were not 5 people that entered, but 3. So 2 people had decided either not to turn up or were busy elsewhere. The lip-reading experts were able to establish that Brian Reader had not actually turned up on the second night. He had either lost his nerve, he bottled it, or he determined that the fact that the hydraulic pump had failed, it was a sign that they really shouldn't go any further. Returning to the scene of a crime to try again is very rarely successful. So he'd said no. And during this meeting, Collins, who actually wasn't physically in the vault at the time, they were listening to Perkins explain in detail how they used the hydraulic ram to push over the bolted cabinet. And what had happened was Jones and I believe Mr. Ginger had wormed their way through this 3 overlapping hole, and using sledgehammers, they broke open the doors of the safe deposit boxes and filled their wheelie bins. The bugged cars also yielded another name. Someone called Carl Wood, another career criminal, a bit younger than the rest of his cohorts. He was in his mid-50s. He was the one dubbed by the press as the Strong Man, or Mr. Strong. Now, through a lot of the conversations that were recorded, Brian Reeder was not the only one to bottle it on the second night. And the police probably thought there was anyway, because of course 5 became 3. But Carl Wood did actually turn up on the second night. Reeder hadn't bothered at all. Carl did turn up. But it was discussed that Collins particularly was really not happy with Wood, because Wood got nervous when he noticed that there was a light on in the safe deposit facility. He was convinced that this was not going to work, so he walked away. So the only people that were there on the second night were Collins the lookout, and inside the vault were Perkins, Jones and Mr. Ginger. The stronger pump was successful and had pushed over the cabinet. Why, though, was such a small amount open, less than 10%? It was thought that specific boxes were targeted, that they had researched into what was where. But when they actually went around the perimeter of the room, they meaning the police, it was found that at the top, you'd have the very, very small little boxes. And at the bottom, you'd have really big ones. You'd find that with lockers at a swimming baths. You'd have the small ones at the top and the larger ones at the bottom. The ones that had been opened were all kind of at head height. So they were the easier ones to open. If you try to open one that's at the top, that's a huge amount of effort for no reason, because you might not even be successful there. You may not be able to reach it. And those hammers are not easy to lift either. Plus, if you manage to bash one open, it can come out and hit you on the head. So the ones in the middle were targeted, because if you also tried to open one at the bottom, you probably wouldn't be able to haul out what was in there. The men did talk about this other man called Mr. Ginger, but it was obvious that he had somehow disappeared. He didn't meet up with the guys, or he didn't have much contact with them. And the group called him Basil. Due to his evasion of the police, the press were now calling him the Ghost. So Mr. Ginger, the Ghost, but we're now going to just refer to him as Basil, as it's much easier. Basil had disappeared. He hadn't talked to the group. He hadn't telephoned the group. There was no phone connection. This person called Basil seemed to have been a bit more savvy than the other people of the gang. And it's likely that he took his carvery of the loot and kept it. The main concern of the flying squad was not so much apprehending the suspect, it was recovering the stolen property. That was the main thing. The police could easily have swooped in on them and arrested them. But what they really wanted was to get as much of this prize back to their original owners as possible. And the way to do that was to wait for the men to carry out something called a slaughter, which is where criminals who have stolen a huge amount of goods will meet each other and then carve up or divvy up the prize. It was later revealed that Collins had made a bit of a mistake. He had entrusted some of the loot to a man called William Lincoln, who had gone on holiday the day after the heist, and he had given that part of the loot, or at least a fair bit of it, to someone else. The gang were able to get some of that back, or all of it back, it's not really sure, but Collins really wasn't happy with what Lincoln had done. Collins said in a TV interview that Lincoln, who was his brother-in-law, didn't know anything about what had gone on. He just said to him, "Can you look after this for me? It's nothing. Don't worry about it." But another thing was, immediately after they successfully carried out this heist, the gang drove to Kelly Collins' house in the transit van, not in the Mercedes. That was where the loot was kept for at least the first 24 hours. The person interviewing Collins said, "Why did you not divvy it up right there and then?" And he said, "Well, they didn't have enough time. There was so much of it. And Collins' wife had gone away for the Easter weekend and she was going to come back the next day. So they had to arrange for another time. So the loot was divvied up, but not for everybody to keep. They needed to make sure that it was all shared. So each man took something and had to store them somewhere." 6 weeks after the heist, so not a long time at all, the gang had been tracked and traced throughout London. They had to meet up somewhere relatively public, but not too in the public eye because it would look quite suspicious. Perkins had arranged for his daughter to go on holiday, and she had quite a nice big house in a rather posh part of London. So the gang were actually going to use her house to carry out the slaughter. The men met up in Enfield in a car park on the 19th of May 2015, which was not owned by, but the car park was used by a man called Hugh Doyle, who was a friend of Collins. The men arrived in their vehicles and pretty much everything was piled into Collins' Mercedes to be taken to Perkins' daughter's house. And the police were in hot pursuit. The only people getting the spoils were Collins, Perkins and Jones. Reader and Wood had bailed, and Basil had gone off with whatever he had. So just these three men were there, including Doyle and Lincoln. A few moments after the gang arrived, the police swooped in and arrested all of these men. It was estimated that about only a third of what was stolen was actually found to be in Perkins' daughter's house, as well as other properties associated with these men. Collins, Perkins, Jones, and Lincoln were all arrested on the spot. Doyle was arrested at another location, and Reader and Wood were also arrested somewhere else. What was interesting to the police was how the men had meticulously planned this. They had planned 3 years before the heist to carry this out, and they had watched YouTube videos on how to do certain things like disable an alarm and operate a diamond drill. There was one point of humour of this case is that in one of the men's houses, Forensics for Dummies was found, thought to be pretty much their handbook on how to carry this out. Now, to their credit, Reader, Collins, Perkins and Jones all pleaded guilty to avoid the trial. They said they did it. However, Lincoln, Doyle and Wood pleaded not guilty, so that went to trial. Lincoln had recruited a man called John Harbinson, who was his nephew, to help move the stolen goods, but apparently told him that there was nothing to worry about in those bags, it was just a load of shit. Harbinson also pleaded not guilty. Wood was found guilty of attempted burglary. Lincoln and Doyle were found guilty of handling stolen goods, and Harbinson was cleared of all charges. Daniel Jones he tried to play the system when he was in custody. He said he wanted to go straight. He wanted to reform himself. So he said that he'd take the police to where he had stashed some of his part of the loot, which he hadn't brought along to the slaughter, in a place called Edmonton Cemetery. He claimed to have buried it all in one location, said that was all of it, that's all he had. Yet the police are kind of clever. They were able to find many other locations in this cemetery where some more loot was stored. Yet this was not the end. Now it was time to find the elusive Basil. For 3 years, Basil's identity remained unknown. But what the public didn't know was that the police did have someone in mind. They were just keeping it very, very hush-hush. The flying squad returned to the footage they gathered with Collins and tried to see if there was anyone he met up with who they hadn't quite eliminated or who raised suspicion. And there was one person they just couldn't eliminate, but they didn't know what his name was. They couldn't trace him to an address. Collins had met up with this man on 3 occasions, and on the 3rd occasion, the police decided to leave Collins and follow this man. It wasn't clear into which building he'd went, but the police were able to find out who lived in this building, and eventually, through the process of elimination, were able to narrow it down to one person, Michael John Seed. Seed was someone who had really thought about his traces. He had no phone, he wasn't employed, he didn't have a bank account, he was untraceable basically. Once he'd done the job, he was gone. Yes, he met up with Collins a couple of times, and that was enough to seal his fate. But the police needed a lot more evidence than just his name, because his name itself threw up a lot of suspicion, which is how they were able to eliminate the others in the area, because Seed was a career criminal. Yet they needed more evidence. Strangely enough, the crucial piece of evidence came through assessing how Seed walked. The flying squad observed Seed as he went about his daily business, and they compared the footage of him just casually walking through some of the parks to the footage of the man in the boiler suit, or Basil, walking past Hatton Garden. It was also found that Seed had a very similar posture and body type to Basil, but when the footage of Seed and Basil walking were looked at side by side, it was found that their gaits were very, very similar. It can only be described as a swagger, a way of flicking the foot right out in front and then sort of moving side to side. It was very, very similar, even though in the footage of Basil walking, he had something over his shoulder, and therefore that might have impeded his way of walking. It was very, very similar. 2 years after starting to observe this man, they swooped in, and in his flat, they found a lot of gold and jewellery from the heist. And it amazed people that 3 years after the heist, he still had quite a lot of the stuff there. Although some of the gold had been melted down, they found a gold smelter in the flat. So quite a lot of people had gold jewellery that had been destroyed pretty much. The flying squad were confident that they had found the elusive Basil. Seed pleaded not guilty, but he was found guilty on all charges. Now, it's interesting to note that the 4 main burglars, Reader, Collins, Perkins and Jones, who all pleaded guilty, the sentences were slightly reduced. They ranged from, I think, from 6 to 7 years. But Seed, because he was one of the active burglars and he wasn't someone who bailed, and he'd pleaded not guilty, he actually was given 10 years. 7 months after the Hatton Garden heist, the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company went into liquidation, and it's not surprising. The place had been brutally vandalised. And security, this is supposed to be like Fort Knox. It had been breached by a group of grandpas. That's what people were thinking. What on earth was going on here? This was not a victimless crime, as many people think. It was said on 60 Minutes Australia and on other TV shows and news broadcasts that many people didn't feel sorry for the victims because they apparently were rich toffs who had lots of money, and they would have been okay. No. A lot of the businesses in Hatton Garden that were directly affected by this heist went out of business. There were people whose items weren't insured, they couldn't claim, and they never got them back. Quite a lot of things were returned to the original people, but only about a third, maybe even only a half, of what was stolen has ever been recovered. Family heirlooms. People had their children's security and inheritance tied up in that place, and their kids would end up with nothing. Or people's university funds and their pensions were tied up here, and they lost it. Even those who were not directly affected by the heist, they were affected by the insurance claims, because if you're not aware, the way that insurance works is that everyone's premium is put into a communal pool, and it is out of that pool that claims are paid. Now, even if you don't claim, if that pool is depleted by something sudden like this, unfortunately, they have to replenish it, so premiums do go up. So this, as I said, is not a victimless crime. A crime is a crime precisely because it leaves hurt and pain in its wake. We have laws against certain deeds that cause damage to people physically and materially. And even though there was no violence used in this, people were hurt at the end of it. Their livelihoods were hurt. People didn't have much trust in security anymore. This type of behavior goes against what makes us human and why we've got this far. If we had been this callous towards one another and stealing and murdering people, we wouldn't have been able to get here because there wouldn't be anyone to be here. It's us being honest and protective and making sure we are prosperous that has got us to this point. But there are people like this gang who will just want to get their hands on easy money. And this was not easy. It seems that this was not just about the spoils and the loot and the prize at the end of it, but it was doing the impossible. If anyone could say they've broken into Fort Knox or, this place in particular, if they can go away and say they've done it. The police also had to make a public apology because they had failed to act on the alert sent by the security guard that night. So the security guard and the security company, they did their job, but the police didn't do theirs. And if they had, they would have been able to catch the burglars in the act. The burglars would have got lighter sentences probably. Possibly, the safe deposit facility wouldn't have gone into liquidation because security would have been tight at that point. But there wasn't a problem with the actual security firm, it was the police. Nonetheless, the gang still managed to physically break into the vaults. So it's understandable why the businesses and people that use the facility lost their faith. Just a side note, it actually turned out to be Reader who was the mastermind behind all of it. He was given the title of the governor, the master, Reader the leader, although I don't know if that was official. That's why I would call him Reader the leader. Yet he was the one who bailed on the second night. He didn't even turn up. Carl Wood at least turned up and then left because he lost his nerve after there was a sign that this wouldn't go well. Terry Perkins has since passed away. Collins is now out on parole. I believe a couple of others are still in prison, and many still protest their innocence. There are some processes going in place against some of the burglars to recoup some of the money through acquiring their legitimate assets, and some of the men are actually challenging that. If you obtain money legitimately, you won't have to cover your tracks because it's legitimate for a reason. In one of the documentaries I saw, there was a quote used which I think really did sum this up. These were analog criminals operating in a digital world, and that was also what led to the downfall, that they believed that just meeting up in a public place wouldn't lead the police to other people. Registration software for vehicles. In this day and age, it's very, very hard to pull off heists and things like this because there's so much surveillance and there's so many things the police, like the flying squad, can do to find out who you are and where the loot is. So I hope this has been entertaining and educational for you, and I do wish to do some other non-murder cases, a bit like I did with Hatton Garden. So if you have any ideas, please let me know below. I'm also on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok. I have a Patreon, but I haven't really set it up properly yet. I need to make sure I've got a few thousand subscribers first. If you can help me out with that, that would be great. So if you can please click the subscribe button. If you're not already subscribed, please, please, please help me out. Just click it. It takes just a couple of seconds. And if you want to unsubscribe at a later date, you can do, but it would help me out greatly. And plus you get to see me every couple of weeks. Anyways, thank you very, very much for watching, and I'll see you later, little berries. Bye.